Ever heard of the show 1,000 Ways to Die? Well, if you take a look at our 300,000 years of history, you'll soon come to realize that 1,000 isn't even anywhere close to cutting it. Try more like 1,000,000, if even that's enough. And through the ages, people have had to endure some pretty painful demises, some of which were definitely worse than others. But thankfully, thanks to technology and general progress, horrific endings are becoming less common than they used to be, especially because of just how tough ancient Earth was compared to now. And we can only guess what kind of life our ancestors had to go through, but once in a while we don't have to, as occasionally researchers would get really lucky at the expense of a seriously unfortunate individual. And we get to see firsthand some of the catastrophic injuries that ancient people had to endure and sometimes even survived. But the first case definitely wasn't a survive kind of situation, and unfortunately is a mode of death still within the realm of possibility, as it was a shark attack, but not just any old shark attack, but rather the first conclusive one recorded in history, an achievement that certainly nobody wants to have. Now, if you're planning a trip to Japan, don't panic quite yet. Yes, there are still sharks there now, but the situation was much dicier back then. A number of known shark teeth imply that their populations were significantly higher than they are now. This is also reflected by the Jomon culture, which features multiple art pieces that depict various sharks, namely hammerheads and tiger sharks. So it's likely that attacks were much more common back then. Now clearly this particular incident had a rather regrettable ending, but not all horrific injuries ended so poorly. Sometimes ancient humans not only survived traumatic wounds, but even thrived afterwards. But alas, we also know that humans in the past, and for that matter, can be quite cruel. You know this all too well if you've seen recent videos circulating on your local social media feed. The current world we occupy is also host to unusually cruel violence, which can be downright horrifying to say the least. However, one of the worst cases of unusually cruel violence in our distant past was seen in the case of the girls of St. Paul-Troy Chateau of France. This grisly discovery involved 3 women who were found buried together back in the 80s, but dated to about 5,500 years ago. Only recently did scientists unveil that a cruel sacrificial ritual had taken place. In total, 3 victims were found. 2 of them were buried in very contorted positions and stuffed into very tight spaces, while being completely covered by heavy grindstones likely meant to keep them down and from moving. This signifies that these 2 had been buried alive and against their will. Furthermore, the positions of their arms and legs suggested that while decayed now, a rope had at some point not only bound them but tied their legs to their necks, causing them to involuntarily strangle themselves. This coincidentally mirrors a torturous killing tactic sometimes used by the Italian mafia, named inapo. However, while the mafia do it today for revenge against traitors, these Neolithic murders were some sort of agricultural sacrifice. They were buried in a structure that mimicked a silo grain, and the 3rd woman was buried on top of them, unbound and above the stones, presumably for symbolic purposes. The location was also quite peculiar, as it was built in a way that during the solstice the sun would shine directly on the silo. So, in other words, whoever was behind this was quite twisted, yet unarguably well organized. Now obviously neither are good ways to go, and honestly I'm not sure if you'd rather be shot or drowned. And unfortunately though, we know that definitely happened with another specimen who is now known as the first modern human that we know of to have drowned. Ironically, he did so in one of the driest places on Earth, the Atacama Desert. This harsh and unforgiving region is found in Chile, and is perhaps the oldest desert on the planet, meaning that, at any rate, this Neolithic man who dated to 5,500 years ago still lived in the area when it was absolutely dry. Yet his body was found in a round stone structure on top of seashells, which does kind of make sense because he lived on the coast, meaning that water was accessible. Originally, scientists weren't sure what happened to him, as he wasn't super old, being about 35 to 45 years old at the time of his death, and he didn't have any clear fatal injury or disease either. However, because he lived close to the sea and was buried with lots of shells, there was a thought that he drowned. But how does one figure out if a 5,000-year-old plus man drowned or didn't with just bones? And surprisingly, you take a look at those bones and look for diatoms, which is basically any member of a large group comprising several genera of algae. And alas, diatoms were indeed found in his skeleton, implying that he drowned. Let's just say that's a very unpleasant sign, because the only way that diatoms can end up in one's bones is if you inhale water such that when it reaches the lungs, your pulmonary alveoli rupture. Then, salt water rushes into your bloodstream before making it into your bone marrow, hence the presence of these algae, a brutal ending for an already harsh life. As it turns out, the man was already in very poor condition, showing signs of having arthritis, bad enough to damage his bones. His legs were roughed up as well, suggesting a life spent squatting, perhaps to harvest shells. His arms and shoulders were further messed up, reflecting a life rich in swimming, rowing and harpooning, which matches the assumption that he was part of a coastal community. And just for a cherry on top, he also appeared to be extremely iron deficient. That was chalked up to a severe tapeworm infection, which can be common in mishandled fish. And just to make everything a tad bit more tragic, it turns out that he did not die alone, but with 3 others, another male, an adult female, and even 1 infant. Radiocarbon found that all 4 had died at the same time. But how, you might ask? Well, they lived in a very seismic area, and so it's believed that an earthquake and then a subsequent tsunami is what did them in. But what's rather peculiar is that when they tested the rest of the skeletons for diatoms, they found none, heavily suggesting that, unlike the man, they had not drowned. So now, while it's still possible that an earthquake had killed them from the non-drowning related dangers, it is now less likely that a tsunami and earthquake is what did them in. The current hypothesis is that the man just accidentally drowned, maybe while diving down to forage, while the others just happened to die around the same time and location from other causes. After all, the Atacama Desert was and is a very grueling place where it could be hot, cold and very, very dry. Sometimes we humans made it more painful than it already was and had to be. Just take a look at this guy or this girl, or really any of the other 38 humans found in France with holes in their skulls. What you're looking at is not a mass murder crime scene or even warfare, but rather a poor attempt at surgery, also known as trepanning, which, as the skulls show, involved drilling a hole into one's head and was perhaps Homo sapiens' first widespread surgery. Unfortunately, the site in France specifically dates to about 6,500 BC, making it one of the oldest, if not the first, cases of trepanning that we know of. But it was by no means isolated, and multiple sites have been found with evidence of this strenuous procedure, supplying us with an abundance of brutal fossils. Some studies even suggest that up to 10% of all Neolithic people underwent this treatment, if you can call it that. And in the French site, it was closer to 33%. Given the super high rate, you'd assume it was pretty safe, but no, it's about what you'd expect from drilling a hole in your head. Less than 40% of the skulls showed any signs of healing, meaning more than 60% died. The main ways of death were likely infection, blood loss, and of course trauma to the brain if the surgeon went too deep. Even if they were in the metaphorical clear, healing was no joke, often taking several months for the area to close up, and even then it was likely you'd still feel awful. Plus the fact you had to endure the surgery itself, which definitely took place with no painkillers or anesthesia. Now, to do the surgery, it's thought that sharpened stone knives, or in some cases even seashells, were used to carry out the procedure. People at virtually every age were found having done this. So, looking at the widespread nature of this procedure, you might ask, what was the purpose of this? Well, basically anything. According to some potential reasons, it included spiritual purposes, treatment for epilepsy, relieving head wounds, which were more common at the time courtesy of ourselves, or it could have been done for something as simple as a headache. So basically, if you woke up in ancient times and you had a throbbing migraine, best to keep that to yourself. And perhaps surprisingly, or maybe unsurprisingly, this surgery remained popular for quite some time and actually is still carried out today, just with a bit more precision and only done in select cases. Not to mention we now have much better management for the procedure and pain. And speaking of pain, there's something we seem to have left behind too. Of course, it's still a thing, but life for our ancestors was far more harsh and agonizing due to the primitive state of lesser early technology. Just ask the girl of Ore Moor, affectionately known as Mura by some. She is an Iron Age specimen that is also a bog body. In other words, a human that was found and sometimes naturally mummified within a peat bog. Just in case you're wondering what that is, it's a wetland that has accumulated peat. Surprise, surprise, and other decayed organic material. Now, Mura was originally located in the year 2000, and her founders actually thought that she had been a girl that went missing after visiting a club many decades before. But after doing some testing, they realized that she was in reality a 1,000-plus-year-old skeleton who had lived in Iron Age Germany. Despite only being around 17 to 19, she had endured more pain than most in their lifetime. Just about every bit of her body had some sort of damage to it. Even looking at it as a whole, researchers concluded that she must have led a life of intense physical labor, probably consisting of carrying heavy loads like water jugs as she routinely navigated through the marshlands. Then her head had not one, but two severe fractures that had healed over, demonstrating brain injuries that might have come from attacks by hostile people or even people within her own community, with their shape reflecting blunt impacts. And we do know that head trauma and violence were a bit more common during the Iron Age. But at any rate, she definitely survived that specific ordeal, yet she likely suffered from frequent headaches and potentially other neurological symptoms. And it really seems like she couldn't catch a break because she also appeared to have a benign tumor at the base of her skull. That likely just compounded on her already existing headaches while also causing a curvature in her spine, leading to back pain and chronically inflamed legs, which was severe enough to alter her bones. While her own body seemed to be against her, so did the environment, as there were further signs that during harsh winters she endured frequent periods of sickness and in her childhood had chronic malnutrition, reflected by the unusual morphology of her bones. So, in other words, each day would have been a challenge for her. Even if she didn't have to do anything, let alone survive, during the Iron Age, she clearly did not last long, because even 19 was considered below the life expectancy, which at that point hovered at around 26 years old. Now, we don't know what killed her, but it's believed that, thankfully, murder was off the table, considering that there are no clear signs. Right now, it's tentatively believed that she died in a freak accident. However, one mystery that remains is that she was found alone and naked, with not even any objects or jewelry being associated with her, suggesting that someone had altered her body after death and then, presumably, buried her into the bog. Which, again, makes one wonder why. Why not just bury her on land? And the answer is that maybe they were trying to hide something. And sadly, not even in death did Mura get a break, as when she was recovered back in the day, it was done accidentally after a machine had scooped up her remains, but not before ripping them into 100 different pieces that needed to be stitched back together. So with that example alone, I think we can conclude that life can really just be dang hard, which is a fact shared by what is currently the first known victim of the plague, a 5,000-year-old hunter-gatherer from present-day Latvia. He showed signs of having died around the age of 20 and likely did so after being bitten and infected by a rodent. That unassuming bite would one day come to doom him, as it happened to be laced with a bacteria that humanity knows all too well, Yersinia pestis, in other words, the bacteria responsible for the plagues like that of Justinian and the Black Death. So, not good. Now, when you get the plague, it usually comes in 3 different forms: pneumonic, septicemic, and bubonic. While we don't know which one the man had, it clearly killed him, and unbeknownst to him would proceed to kill over 100 million other people through the years, which is crazy. I mean, seriously, nature just seemed to be more messed up back then, and as previously mentioned, we as humanity seem to follow that trend. Especially during the Neolithic, and there's a buffet of minded skeletons to choose from that time. And that pun is intended because many of them showed signs of cannibalism. Additionally, we also have nicely preserved specimens that show us that one could go through dismemberment, decapitation, being burned alive, stabbed, bludgeoned, shot with an arrow, or sometimes a combination of all these things together. And obviously, while violence still occurs, in many ways it is comparatively much more tamed in the present. It's also worth mentioning the trend of doing this to large groups as well. Over 100 mass murder sites are known from throughout the world, showcasing ancient man's enthusiasm for violence and creativity and cruelty. Maybe the takeaway is that for all the flaws of the present, maybe today isn't so bad after all. Thanks for watching. And until next time, please like, share, comment, and subscribe to the Science and History Archives channel for more amazing content. And as always, we'll see you on the next one.